right, today we're going to talk about carbohydrates, one of the four major classes of organic macromolecules. Carbs are really used by cells for fuel and for building material. And carbs include simple sugars like fructose, I'm sure you've encountered that pretty commonly in your diet, and polymers such as starch. So carbohydrates are really distinguished from other organic macromolecules because they are mainly made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and specifically in the ratio of a 1 to 2 to 1. So 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So for example, glucose is C6H12O6. So it follows this rule of 1 to 2 to 1 carbon, hydrogen, oxygen ratio. Now, one little hint about the name carbohydrate is if you look at the name, it's carbo, think of carbon, and hydrate, think of water. So as you look at this ratio, CH2O, here you have your C carbo, and the H2O is your hydrate. So that's an easy way to remember what carbohydrates are made of. So the basic building block of carbohydrates are monosaccharides, mono meaning single, saccharide meaning sugar, and they can be combined together to form disaccharides, so di meaning 2, saccharide sugar. And as you build up this chain of monosaccharides, you end up having a polysaccharide. So these monosaccharides are the monomers, and simple ones include glucose and ribose. And you're going to know that these are sugars because they end in ose, the OSE. Now, polysaccharides are more complex structures. They're made up of polymers of these monosaccharides. So there are two types of polysaccharides. One is storage and the other is for structure. And so plants store their carbohydrates in the form of starch, while animals store their carbohydrates, excess carbohydrates, in the form of glycogen. In terms of structure, plants have building materials of really anchoring their cell walls and making it structurally strong through material called cellulose. And then the exoskeleton of arthropods is made up of a material called chitin. Now, these molecules of starch, glycogen, cellulose, or chitin, they might be made of very similar building blocks, but they differ in their position and orientation of the glycosidic linkage. This is the type of bond that joins these monomers together. So here's the classification of some monosaccharides. And as I said before, these sugars end in ose, so you'll know that that's what those are. So 3 carbon sugars, again, forms the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of C3H6O3. These are called trioses, these 3 carbon sugars. So glyceraldehyde is an example of a triose. Pentoses are 5 carbon sugars. So again, that C5H10O5, the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So ribose here, this is actually a sugar and it is a component of RNA. Our very common 6 carbon sugars or hexoses are, the chemical formula is C6H12O6. So both glucose and fructose, if you see that, have the same C's, H's, and O's, but they differ in their arrangement. So these are actually structural isomers. So again, glucose and fructose, both common sugars that you've probably heard of and used as energy sources for organisms. So glucose can actually be in the linear form, or it can actually form a ring. And so here in this diagram, you see a ring structure of glucose, and these rings can be attached to one another. So in this diagram up above, if you put 2 glucoses together, they are joined together by dehydration synthesis. And so you see the OH on one glucose and the H on the other glucose. They come together to form H2O. And this bond that's formed between them is covalently bonded. And this special type of bond with that oxygen in the middle, this is called a glycosidic linkage. And 2 glucoses together form the disaccharide called maltose. On the bottom picture, you have glucose, join together with fructose in a dehydration synthesis reaction, and that forms the disaccharide called sucrose. So sucrose is another name for table sugar. Glucose is the fuel for our cells, and fructose you find as the sugar in fruit and in your carbonated beverages like high fructose corn syrup. So one of the things to really note is, again, structure dictates function even when it comes to carbohydrates. So it turns out there's two forms of glucose, alpha glucose and beta glucose. And as you can see in the left picture and the right picture of glucose, it really just differs by the position of that OH group, the hydroxyl group. In alpha glucose, that hydroxyl group points downward, and in beta glucose, the hydroxyl group points upward. Now, this makes a difference because when you try to combine together alpha glucose molecules, you end up making starch. But if you combine together the beta glucose monomers, it creates a different chemical compound called cellulose. Now, when you look at the C's, H's, and O's, they're composed of the same atoms, but because the arrangement is slightly different, the structures differ, therefore the functions will differ as well. So in our digestive systems for humans, we can digest starch, but we cannot digest cellulose. We don't have the enzymes to break down cellulose. So other types of, so as you can see with plants, they have the monomers of the alpha glucoses and it forms starch right here. And we also use alpha glucoses to put together to form glycogen. And so we do have the enzymes to be able to break down both starch and glycogen. However, plant cells, which are surrounded by that cell wall, are made of fibers called cellulose, and the cellulose is made up of those beta glucose monomers, and we can't break it down in our digestive systems because we don't contain the enzymes. Okay. Other structural polysaccharides include cellulose and chitin. And so chitin is the exoskeleton found in arthropods or insects. It's that crunchy part of the outside. Okay, so that's it for carbohydrates for today.